where at the beginning of an argument, saw this in the Obamacare case that came down, where Justice Roberts, during oral argument, was pushing this idea. Well, if the fine or the tax for not going along with the mandate to get insurance, was this a fine or a tax? And up to that point, the Obama administration is saying, no, no, it's a fine. It's not a tax, because popularly you don't want to say you're imposing a tax. But the Solicitor General, during oral argument, changed it and said, oh, well, of course it's not a fine, it's a tax. And when Roberts wrote the opinion, it basically, and the news reports were hilarious, because the reporters came out, flying out down the steps of the Supreme Court, starting to read the opinion, saying, well, Obamacare is thrown out because Justice Roberts says this, and then until he got to the last page where Roberts says, no, it's simply a tax, and the federal government can impose a tax. And you see that the people on the court are thinking people. They're able to be persuaded from one side to the other. And I think that's a wonderful thing in the evolution of our Supreme Court and our federal court in general.
And just to underscore Bill's point, I mean, if one looks back, 60 years, Earl Warren, who was appointed by Dwight Eisenhower, was a conservative jurist from California, but he ends up sort of ruling on one of the most important cases in the 20th century, Brown versus Board of Education, and in a way that one wouldn't have expected him to do 5 years earlier. There's a really interesting film that came out in, I don't want to say the early 90s. It's called Separate but Equal, and it's sort of about the Warren Court. And it's really fascinating. I mean, and it addresses the point that Bill was saying. Justices grow while they are working. I mean, you don't get appointed, theoretically, one should not get appointed to the Supreme Court just based on what they did, but their capacity to evolve. And I think when we think about the great jurists, we think about those people. Sandra Day O'Connor was one of those as well. And as Bill said earlier, it appears that there's some of the criticisms of Justice John Roberts has been that he has grown too much intellectually. He takes himself too seriously. I mean, that's one of the criticisms, as opposed to just simply duplicating what the president who appointed him wanted him to do.
And on the other side, one of I think the longest serving justice on the Supreme Court, William O. Douglas, was appointed by FDR because he was one of, in social issues, one of the most liberal, but on business issues, the man had a background in economics. And so, business litigants loved going in front of William O. Douglas because he understood economics better than probably any other Supreme Court justice we've ever seen. So you see this evolution, you see this give and take, this tug of war going on, which I think is a marvelous thing for our high court to have.
So again, I apologize for my own computer difficulties. The recording has started again. We had a couple of questions about the fair tax, and I don't know if anyone on this panel is especially up on the details about the fair tax, but I did ask one of our colleagues, Professor Alice Keene over in the College of Business, to give me a little bit more detail about the fair tax and what it's actually about. And the questions actually pertained to some of the things we've been seeing in the media about what happens after a state passes a fair tax or a progressive income tax. And her reply was that Illinois is somewhat unusual in having a flat income tax. Out of the 43 states that impose an income tax, only 11, including Illinois, have a flat income tax. The rest, 32 states, impose some form of a graduated income tax. She doesn't know whether of any of these 32 states with a graduated structure ever switched from a flat structure, the way Illinois is proposing to do next week. She says it's very possible that all of the 32 states started out with a graduated rate when they first imposed an income tax. She had, so I'm just gonna open it up to the rest of the panel. What are some of the controversies that you all seen in terms of the fair tax proposal? And are there any sort of answers that you can provide based on your knowledge of the proposal?
Okay, the business professor is going to start on that one too. Actually, I think within like the last 2 decades, about I think it's 3 or 4 states had flat tax, went to a graduated. And I only know that because opponents to this fair tax proposal point out that each of those states then subsequently increased all of the tax rates. So the fear is if we go from the flat tax to the graduated tax, you would be seeing, everyone getting a tax increase, which is one of the sort of the political realities of the flat tax constitutional amendment. When that was put into our state constitution back in 1968, it was there was the belief that a flat rate tax was actually it was later than 68 because it was adopted, somewhat back in the late 60s, early 70s. That a flat rate across the board was fair. Everyone pays the same rate. The higher income would pay more money, but it would be the same rate. Sort of the political reality is it's harder to increase taxes, income tax, if it's a flat rate, because then it affects everyone. It's easier to increase taxes. The old saying was that don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the guy behind the tree. So you say, oh, we're not going to tax you, we're going to tax those folks over there. And that makes it a lot easier to pass politically. So the political reality makes a flat tax difficult to raise taxes. The state legislature now has the ability, has the power to raise the income tax, but it has to raise it on everyone. By putting in by passing the flat tax, then actually what would happen, the state legislature has already passed legislation that will spring into life if this amendment to the Constitution takes place with set rates for different income levels. Again, they can change that anytime in the near future for different income levels. So there's that.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere, I'm trying to find where I read it, that if the fair tax passes and the graduated income tax therefore goes into effect, everybody making $250,000 or less has the same, and even people who make less than 100,000 will actually have lower taxes to pay, and that people, the millionaires, et cetera, would have to pay a higher tax rate. I think that there would be a legitimate argument against your point, Bill, that that's not fair. I think that the argument that has been made historically for progressive taxation is that the wealthier citizens among us and the large corporations, et cetera, they take more advantage of the public services that are available. They're able to take more advantage of the roads, of the transportation infrastructure. They're able to take more advantage of the educational infrastructure because they have an educated workforce that they can draw from. Did anyone else want to add anything to that?
I guess we could note simply that the data is widely available on what the graduated income taxes look like in different states. And so, the rates being proposed here in Illinois are, I think relatively high for high earners, but still significantly lower than the numbers we see in places like Hawaii and California. Right. So I think somebody who's dogged about the issue can educate themselves relatively rapidly about what the effects of imposing a graduated income tax will be on the overall economy and functioning of the state government. Obviously Illinois is its own state, but we've got lots of examples to draw from.
I would and you're right. There's a lot of stuff out there on both sides on this. My only caution is remind folks when you say, yeah, Hawaii has got a big income tax, but also look at the other taxes imposed by that state. Illinois has the highest sales tax of all 50 states. We have the second highest property tax. So the tax burden is Illinois is pretty good. In the last 3 years, we've seen job growth across the country. But Illinois was 46th in job growth. What would this tax do to that? So there's also, you know, what are the consequences of this? You know, we leave that up to you, the voters.
But do you think, Bill, that sales tax might go down if we have a progressive income tax? Because after all, sales tax is regressive in a sense, because those of us at the lower end of the income spectrum tend to spend more of our income on retail sales that are taxed, and those of us at the higher end of the spectrum tend to spend less of our income on sales that are taxed.
Yeah, and on necessities as opposed to luxuries. Agreed. But I guess I've lived long enough in this state that I'm not too optimistic about Springfield lowering sales tax. Sorry, Springfield, but there's always hope, David.
I guess that comes down to a larger question. I mean, I come from a state similar to Illinois. I'm from New York, and we have similar feelings around the state in New York of our legislature. But ultimately, and that's one of the larger points I think we're trying to make today with this panel, isn't the government us? I mean, isn't it our responsibility to turn the bums out if they're bums, and, you know, put good people in if they're good people? You know, doesn't that come down to our responsibility as voters rather than just?
I think James and Elliot want to say something.
Yeah, unmute everybody, get in on it, free for all.
As Ben Franklin said, David, it's a republic if you can keep it. So. Which is, you know, we're educators. I love election years because it's a great learning opportunity, and I use it in teaching auditing when I talk about, you know, sampling and, you know, statistical sampling and what polls do and all this. This is, and as Barry pointed out, this is a great time for learning about the Electoral College. And I'm going to throw something out there, which is this is a fun one. What happens if after Tuesday we find we have 269 and 269 a tied Electoral College? What happens then?
I know, but I think you and I have been doing a little too much of the talking.
Yeah.
I'll just chime in on the so I'm not a political scientist or you know, a law scholar or even historian, but from the communication side of things, I think how we talk about things, what we call things, really makes a difference. For instance, I mean, the fair tax. I mean, that communicates that it's fair, right? And so I mean, that's just, you know, an observation. Similar to the idea of tax burden, like this idea, like calling it a tax burden, like it's a bad thing, was a rhetorical strategy in the 80s. And it's now, you know, all these years later, some of us on this panel remember the 80s, but you know, that is accepted terminology, tax burden. As opposed to, you could say, hey, this is a bargain. Frankly, when I take my kids to pay our taxes, now I don't make a ton of money. I don't necessarily enjoy spending that money, but I tell my kids, hey, we're getting a bargain on this. Your schools, the streets, and sure, there's things that I wish the money wouldn't go to, but overall, yeah, I mean, I think it's an investment. So the way we talk about, I think we should at least acknowledge the way we talk about things like taxes. We're coming at it from a certain perspective, and that's not necessarily, that perspective isn't necessarily all of reality, right? It's not all of reality. So it's worth carefully thinking about.
I think James raises a really important point about the ways in which we talk about government and particularly taxes. One of the things that always irritates me is the way that there's a kind of discourse among politicians about low taxes, low taxes, low taxes. And I remember hearing about this years ago when I lived in the state of Idaho. I worked in Washington, but lived in Idaho, and Idaho taxes were very low. In fact, I remember when I bought a car in Washington, and then I was moving to Washington from Idaho, but the salesman told me that if I bought the car while an Idaho resident, I'd save about $1,000 in taxes. It's appealing, but I think that we also have to recognize, and I did at the time, that Idaho's tax rates were much lower, but the services were much, much lower. In fact, the street that I lived on in Moscow, Idaho, didn't have sidewalks, didn't have drainage, didn't have those normal things that you would expect in places. Also, I've lived in other states, where the tax rates are very low, but, the services, are just abysmal. And then I've lived in states where, I'm from California, and so tax rates are higher, but again, that general level of services way back when I lived there were much higher. Also, when you travel to other countries, one of the things that American politicians, many who are opposed to, fairer taxation, often complain about European countries having high tax rates. But then when you go to European countries, you think about those services that you can avail yourselves of that are really quite, just amazing. I remember about 20 years ago when my wife and son and I went to France to go to a wedding, and we bought tickets for the French rail system, and they came to like $33 per person per day. You couldn't go from Chicago to Springfield, not that you'd want to, for that much money. And whereas we were going from like Marseille in the south to Paris in the north for, almost just a little bit more than the cost of a bus ticket. And so again, you think about as James said, what those services, what those taxes will do when you have adequate resources to pay for them.
Well, in fact, to James's point, he remembers the 80s. I remember the 70s. Jack Kemp, the conservative icon, especially on matters economics and football quarterback before that, his proposals included, having flat rate taxes. He called it a fair tax. Mm-hmm. So it's funny, what was called the fair tax is been flipped, and the opposition is now calling their proposals a fair tax and a progressive income tax. So the rhetoric, the terminology is very, very important. And as we're seeing in this coming election, dangerously important.
Yeah, I think I'd like to chime in as we're talking about how different topics are framed. I'd like to bring up the media, which is very important in how the media frames different concepts that are political concepts or policy concepts, and how it has something to do with how the public receives the information. The media has a role to play in helping to shape and frame how the voters think about these various public policies, whether it's COVID or whether it's the employment rate, or how many people are unemployed, how that is shaped by the media. So I wouldn't want to leave this conversation as we talk about the election and not talk about the media. I wouldn't want to leave this conversation also without talking about how happy I am to see so many minorities participating in local elections by running for office, more women running for office this time. And I would argue that it is because people were not aware how how many minorities were not participating in running for office, whether it be because they felt like they wouldn't win, or whether it be like they felt like they weren't qualified. I'm not sure. But I am happy about the movement that occurred because of mobilization of other leaders encouraging women, people of color to take a chance and consider running for school board, consider running for county commissioner, consider running for trustee of your village. And I just want to put that out there as we talk about politics, the election, this time of year. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary.
Well, I want to go off of that, which is, as an election official, and maybe it's funny. Maybe one of the good things that came out of COVID-19 is people have been at home, maybe watching more TV, hopefully watching the various news channels, because as you say, how you frame the issue, as an, when I was practicing as an attorney, we used to say, if how you framed the question in front of the court was 90% of victory. If the court looked at the question the way you do, then you could persuade them. And so that's very important. But we are seeing just this incredible turnout right now in the early voting and vote by mail. We've broken all records here in Chicago. And then once we have Tuesday, we will probably see just a huge turnout. So I am thrilled to see. I mean, it's been taking up all of my waking hours when I'm not, doing my work for the university. But it's just been very invigorating to see the citizens stepping up and participating, both as voters, for almost the first time I can remember, we have like every poll worker that we need in Chicago, and that's like 13,500 people for our 2,069 precincts. So people are stepping up at all levels, from the candidates, through poll workers, poll watchers, down to the voters themselves. So this has been a thrilling but exhausting time for me.
Let me just echo the sentiments of my colleagues. As a political scientist, one of the things I've always tried to understand is that there's a gap. It seems there's a gap between the discourse, the rhetoric of the politicians, those who are already in office or running for office, and the public. And again, many different parts of the public, not just one public. And this gap means that the politicians and those who sort of want to stay where we are have one set of rhetoric that defines things in ways that reinforce the importance of their own position. And frequently there's a gap between them and the public, or certainly significant sectors of the public, who want to reframe the questions. I mean, we can think about this in the 1960s with Lyndon Johnson and the way that the Vietnam War as a whole kind of reframed questions. So, the question was reframed from how are we doing to what are we doing there? And what is the cost of being there? And I think that had a remarkable, a significant impact on Lyndon Johnson's decision not to run. And it also introduced other candidates in who were sort of marginal at the moment, but who later became significant factors in American politics. I think we're in one of those periods right now. I mean, I think as Bill mentioned, I think that COVID could have that particular impact in terms of addressing many, but particular one question. I think it asks us, what constitutes a healthy society? What constitutes healthcare? And I think those issues are not going to go away. There is no magic vaccine or any kind of magical cure that's going to address that. And we're going to be talking about what constitutes health, and health care is going to be part of that question as well.
No, I think that leads neatly into another question that was asked by email this week. The question is, if the economy was doing so well prior to the outbreak of the pandemic, should President Trump be held accountable for the economic problems that we've been having since March? I'm rewriting the question to make it less prone to get our own, because we're not here to talk about our own political opinion. And I'll just start it off as a historian. I look back at 1980, and I can say that the American people decided, even though that the economic problems that had been facing the Carter administration had been in existence during the Ford and the Nixon administration, especially the absolutely staggering rise in inflation. But Carter, he made a speech in which he used the word malaise. He was kind of a Debbie Downer, and this was called by the press the malaise speech. And the voters decided to turn him out. A candidate with a charismatic appeal was nominated by the other party and promised to make the economy work again, and won in a landslide. Ronald Reagan did. And so, are there connections to that? I mean, can you hold an incumbent accountable for a major economic problem of the last 7 or 8 months of his or her time in office, or his or her first term? Can you hold an incumbent accountable for a pandemic? Is part of that question, and if so, how? Yeah, just talk.
So I think I'm not going to directly answer this, but I think it's so we could debate. I mean, I think there's helpful conversations to have about how great of an impact does a president have on the economy. I mean, I think there's some real valuable conversation to have there. But I would say that if anyone in leadership takes credit for something going well, then they have kind of logically connected themselves to it themselves when that doesn't go well for that same area. So I don't think it's tough to have it both ways.
Yeah.
Whether that's right or not, but it's tough to have it both ways.
I don't know if all the panel members are old enough to remember a game that kids used to play in grade school. What's the game called? It's like when you set up the chairs. And what's it called?
Musical chairs?
Yeah, musical chairs. It's been a long time for me. But in some sense, I think that, that's kind of an interesting kind of analogy for looking at, claiming particular, as James was saying, this idea that I did this, I contributed to this or that. I can think of so many cases where presidents were essentially blamed, and the public, many times is searching for someone to put the, the tag on, put the label on, or put the blame on. I think about, Jimmy Carter's an example of that. I mean, it wasn't his fault. You think about it in early 1990s, George H.W. Bush, the economy just sort of went into one of those recessions, and he was convenient to blame. By the same token, 8 years later, or less than 8 years later, Bill Clinton was associated with a booming economy, and he didn't necessarily have anything to do with that. I think part of it's just like the musical chairs game. I mean, if you happen to be the musical chairs winning is not about how athletic you are. It's just about where you are at that moment when the music stops.
That's a really good analogy, actually. I was wondering where you were going with that at first, but no, that makes a lot of sense.
I was too, because I forgot the
President. I mean, take it back to the coronavirus for a minute, and because I mean, one of the things that the two nominees have spent a lot of time talking about in the debates when they could get a word in edgewise against one another, and certainly at their rallies, has been the response to the coronavirus. Looks like Elliot needs to take off. Thanks for participating, Elliot. So to what extent is President Trump responsible for where we are now, where is it, 8 or 9 months into lockdown? Maybe lockdown's too strong a word, but 8 or 9 months into remote delivery, to use the educational version of it. And to what extent is it beyond his control?
I think that will be the question of the ages. When Don was speaking, I know we teach in our management classes. One of the hard things to pull apart is, if a company's doing well, the CEO is going to take credit for it. Well, it may be because the economy in general is doing well. And, or when a company's doing poorly, it might not have anything to do with that CEO's management skills and his decisions. The economy itself, or a supply chain problem, or whatever could have been the cause. So trying to pull that apart. What's interesting is in the past week, the president's chief of staff, I think it was on with Anderson Cooper, basically brought the line, hey, it's a virus, it's a pandemic, what can we do about it? And to try and separate their responsibility from what has been happening. So I think that's a question, David, that it'll probably be debated by history professors.
Well, let's start now.
Well, at least long after I'm gone. Yeah.
Let's start now. I mean, who on this panel thinks there's something that he should have done differently? And I regardless of how your own personal I'm not talking about our own personal politics. I'm thinking, imagine you're the president of any party and this is what's going on.
Yeah, I think if there is a something to be a danger, and you say it's not a danger, you downplay it, call it a hoax, say it'll magically go away. I think that's problematic in terms of leadership. So. And again, I don't say, it would be ridiculous to say that he caused the virus or he should have made it go away. That's not on the, I don't think that would be fair, but I do think that there are, there were choices made that I think play out as poor choices.
I think another way, again, sort of underscoring what James is saying, is that the response to any particular problem is a function of where you've positioned yourself earlier. I think that, for example, if you say that if you haven't consulted or haven't elevated the position of, your department, particularly the task force or any other sort of scientifically engaged elements of your administration, then when you face a crisis, then you're not going to be in a position to call upon them or to use them as a reliable ally. The similar situation would be, let's say that as a presidential candidate, you've talked about war and fighting and all those things, and then a crisis comes up, and so you're going to rely upon that. But let's say you're a candidate that has said, we need to sort of think very long about how we use military force. Then when a crisis comes up, you have a lot more leeway in which to say, well, this situation does not warrant force. And so I think there's some candidates, tend to lock themselves into positions that really doesn't afford them a lot of leeway. And so, again, it's not to comment on whether it's a good or bad decision, but I think the way that the candidate, and essentially we go back to that word, which I think is very important here, how they frame the decision-making options.
I think this is probably true, I use another analogy, to any natural disaster,
Mm-hmm.
whether it be an earthquake, fires or hurricanes. You can't really blame the politician for the earthquake or the fire. You can, though, look at what was the policies before in preparing for something that, while you can't control it, is inevitable, or will, at least there's a good chance of it happening, and then the reaction after it happens. So we have to sort of, how much could the pandemic be controlled, because it's a virus and it's going to be hard to control. But what did we do beforehand? How did we react to it? Those things we can hold the public official responsible for.
Should he be wearing a mask? Should he be watching his words, not talking about unproven therapies? Is that what a president should be doing?
Well, actually, I'll bring up something else we started at the beginning. What about the idea of federalism? Is this something the federal government should be doing, or should the various governors have been more in charge, because certainly were states that had very low rates, or the population is widely dispersed. Is this a federal government question or is it a state government question? Aha.
Okay, I'd like to add something to have us think about while we're thinking about what you put out there, Bill, is when we look at the data of the numbers of people dying of COVID-19, I think that has, it has been made public where inequities are in our healthcare systems.
Yeah.
And that is something that, as terrible as COVID has been, a light is shining on what people really didn't want to talk about for poor people and the people who I would call them disinherited for that word choice. And I think that whether the states or the states still look to the federal government to support if they had large numbers of people dying, and they made those requests, whether they were granted or not. No one was really prepared with what was needed, the way COVID hit this country. And so now I think it's less about who we blame and what do we do while we're here, because we see that there's a disparity here, and how we respond to the disparity is important for all of us to think about. I want to, and we think about these dense areas where people are living in cities where you have high populations of people who are not earning a lot of money, who have to go to work every day, who do not have childcare. These are real issues that deal with humanity. And when we think about the have and the have-nots and the large wealth gap between the poor and the wealthy, I just charge us to really look at humanity in the midst of life and death, when people are making decisions and have the power to make decisions, and how power is distributed in those decisions. When we talk about wearing masks, and put the person who's in charge, whether it be the Surgeon General or the two doctors that are in charge, placing them in awkward positions to stand with the data. And as a public administrator, data helps us make decisions in government. That was what Woodrow Wilson said, that it was important that public administrators be educated, be trained to make decisions. So when we talk about federalism or is it to the states, we still need to think about educated, intellectual decisions that make sense. Does it really make sense not to wear a mask if you're going to be in close proximity with people, so that people can live? I'll pass on that.
Well, I think, Mary, as someone who was on the board of directors of an urban hospital for about a decade, I saw these issues all the time, and yet you were like banging your head against the door because nobody was paying attention. And, there's only so much, and it's kind of going back to the whole media question here. There's only so much media space. So maybe one of these, positive consequences of COVID will be, we're now talking about it. The public's talking about it, the media's talking about it, the politicians and public officials are talking about it, and we can now start looking at that data to address these issues, which had not risen to that surface of consciousness yet.
Also, I think that when we think about the presidential leadership, I mean, I think in terms of, it's less about blame, but we think about, when we look back on presidential administrations, we think about what types of visions that they might have had. And I think sometimes those visions of, and we look at it at various levels, the presidential level, the gubernatorial level, legislative level. I mean, for example, one example of this would be the senator from Arkansas back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, William Fulbright. Fulbright was a Rhodes Scholar, I believe, a very, learned man, but from the state of Arkansas, or should I say, and from the state of Arkansas. But the Fulbright program has continues to be sort of a shining light of, how ideally we can interact with each other around the world and the various things the Fulbright program brings in. He was a man of vision on those matters. He was also a visionary on foreign policy matters. But at the same time, we think about presidents who sort of only wanted to capitalize on what was available to them at that moment and didn't have those visions. And I think that certainly, as Mary talked about, the inequalities in terms of wealth, inequalities in terms of access to healthcare, these have been problems that have been around for a while. And certainly, one would expect a president to have some vision on these problems, because these are problems that affect a significant sector, I'd say the majority of people in American society. And if a president doesn't have some vision of how to make a dent into these problems, then they're sort of subjected to being labeled, to being blamed for a whole range of things that they may not have actually had an impact on.
So what happened in 2016? I asked that now because there was someone who asked it in the chat, although I lost all the Q&A questions when my computer died. But let's talk about that now as a preliminary to talking about what we think might happen on Tuesday, or what might not happen on Tuesday, or both. So 2016, what the heck happened there?
Fall of 2016 and spring of 2017, I was teaching political communication, I think 2 sections both semesters, and like reading things in the books, and they're like, this isn't true anymore. It's like throwing it all away. So I'd say on the political communication side of things, yeah, there's been plenty of books and articles and conference presentations given trying to figure out what exactly happened in 2016. I will say that I think, obviously a lot happened. There's not just one answer. I do think a candidate with a clear, simple, or I should say a clear narrative that has enough strategic ambiguity for people to fill in the blanks, what they put in what they want to put in, is a powerful thing. So yeah, that's, I think, a part of it. And I'll add to that, if you come to that particular if you come to a candidate's rhetoric and it lines up with yours, then I think it's going to resonate with you more. So it's not so much do the facts line up. It's not so much do these policies benefit me. It's much more of a, does this narrative line up with my narrative of understanding the world? So that's on the political communication side of things. I think that's part of what happened anyways.
I'd like to throw in another reason or what happened. In my office back at Governor's State, at least it was when I left there in March, I have a t-shirt that reads, "It's in the syllabus." And in a sense, the Clinton campaign versus the Trump campaign, the Clinton campaign didn't read the syllabus, which is how the Electoral College works. they were going for hopefully getting a huge popular victory, and they got it. Not huge, but a popular victory. The Trump campaign, to their credit, read the syllabus and realized it's about winning the Electoral College. And so they concentrated their campaign in those states that they thought they could flip that would give them enough votes. I mean, they stayed out of California, they stayed out of New York, they stayed out of Illinois. They went to those states where they could flip enough votes to win the Electoral College delegates and thus win the election. So I think there's
too much credit. I think that, I think the Trump campaign was incredible, was as surprised as everyone else in the country by what happened.
They were surprised because of what the polling was telling them. From all the national polls, and we know now that Rasmussen was right about everyone else was wrong.
In swing states. I mean, this is for the past 50 years. I mean, or 40 years, let's say. The campaigns are very focused on just a few swing states: Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio. Isn't it more of the case that Michigan and Wisconsin flipped to everyone's surprise, and that therefore the votes from Pennsylvania and et cetera created, the numbers that ultimately.
Well, I think that's true, but then you saw the Clinton campaign, I don't think ever went into Wisconsin. I think they had one, James is saying no, but I think there was also a failure of polling. I mean, there was something came out a couple of months ago that it said, like up to 10% of respondents to polls admitted that, they would lie to the pollster. James, are you going to disagree with me?
Didn't look like it.
You were shaking your head violently.
I was agreeing with you that, Hillary Clinton did not come to Wisconsin.
Yeah, okay. But as I say, she and this was kind of the campaign strategy, as I understand it. They wanted to have this big popular victory, but and kind of went at the whole campaign with a sledgehammer. Where what's her name, Kellyanne Conway, looked at it, as I said, read the syllabus and went at it with a scalpel and picked out those states that would give them enough electoral votes to win. And so I think there's that. And I say the failure of the polls as well.
What role did the sexism play here, though? Is that not a salient point? Just jump in, Mary. Don't raise your hand.
Yeah, something I wanted to say along the line of messaging. In addition, I agree about the polling. I think that there was some feedback that people were saying that they weren't going to vote for President Trump, and they actually were. But the other thing, I think that Hillary's messaging was confusing. There at one time her message was "I'm with her," and then another point it was "We're stronger together." And as we were talking about before, this idea of framing and messaging is, I would argue, is important. And you have the other candidate saying "Make America Great Again," which comes with a lot of ideological background to people who believe that way. And so you're looking at two messages. Let's make America great again. I'm with her. Well, how does that sound to men? I'm with her. How does that sound to women? I'm with her. I mean, and then we're stronger together. Well, which message is it? Is it I'm with her, or is it we're stronger together? I think there was some confusion in there. And I think if there had been one message that was clear, that would have, I'm not saying that would have caused her to win. I'm saying that would have helped with the messaging. Thank you.
One of the other dimensions, I mean, I'm a political scientist, but I don't study voting. But one of the things I've read over the last few years is that turnout in 2016 was much lower than in 2012 and in 2008. And again, to illustrate how critical that was, I mean, the lower turnout rate, and only about a small percentage, but I've seen these studies indicating that if 81,000 African-American voters had registered to vote in the cities of Milwaukee, Detroit, and Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. Yep.
It had 81,000 African Americans registered to vote and voted for Hillary Clinton. Clinton would have won those 3 states, and Trump wouldn't have been president.
Mhm.
But my focus here is again on the perception that this is an urgent election, and because things were economically fairly good in 2016 compared to certainly 8 years later. I think for many Americans the perception was, well, we'll just continue in that vein, and so that the urgency wasn't there, and consequently it had a major impact on turnout and ultimately the election.
Yep. Donald Trump earned less votes than in 4 years ago than Mitt Romney earned 8 years ago in Wisconsin. Sorry, specifically in Wisconsin. So
Mitt Romney's father had been governor, or was that Michigan? I guess
that was Michigan.
That was in Michigan. Yeah, I'm glad you put the gender question out there, David. I think the gender of Clinton, it warrants analysis. Also, the personality of Hillary. Hillary admitted that she was not a Bill Clinton in terms of charisma, in terms of knowledgeable, yes, experience, yes, but like Al Gore, Hillary and Al had something in common, and that was the personality was a little different, and she was running against a person who has a lot of charisma, a lot of personality, a lot of sort of inborn characteristics that she was sort of in competition with. I would like to put that out there too.
That's exactly. Go ahead, whoever's. Okay, I'll talk. I'll talk. I'm taking it over. I'm talking. Damn it, I'm going to talk. No, we sort of election officials are always trying to get people to turn up and vote. And the various studies going back a long time say, we're always trying to come up with new, schemes or methods, because so much polling. You ask people, why didn't you vote? They very conveniently say, well, it's just too difficult to do so. And so we try to make it less difficult and less difficult. It's kind of like when you ask someone, what TV station do you watch? They always say, oh, I watch PBS, when they don't. They watch wrestling, okay? What we find is what gets people out to the polls is you give them interesting candidates, and get them excited about going to the polls. So when you have a Ronald Reagan, okay, when you have a Bill Clinton, when you have a Barack Obama, people will show up to vote for them. When you have an Al Gore, when you, and you, as you said, Mary, Hillary kind of fell into that same sort of like, I'm really not getting excited about that, or to a great many people. So it's who's on that ballot, and and if the issues are also very strong, which I think is what you have this year, and you do have, an exciting candidate, at least on one party, where both you get people excited for, and you also have people excited against him. So I think that really drives turnout, and that's one of the things that hurt Hillary Clinton in 2016.
So let's pivot to 2020.
Can I?
Go ahead, Jim.
Let Jim.
I was just gonna just a couple things. I mean, I'm a communication scholar, so this influences obviously what I teach my students, but I would make a claim, certainly it's the person with the best policy or the best understanding of policy, the person who even has the most most understanding of policy, or even the best skills of governance, they're not necessarily the best campaigners, right? So that's a different skill set. I wish that I wish they were the same skill set, or I wish the American public were, maybe use critical thinking skills a bit more. But that's, it's communication and message. And so that is generally what that's generally what wins election. As far as going back to David's question, what role does sexism have? I think I would say to that, we have not had a female president of the United States of America, and just thinking of that reality is, I think that says a lot.
Going to what you first said there, James, so ultimately our ideal candidate is President Bartlett. Charismatic and wonky,
And there's a lot of people looking for that person and try to convince them to put up with all the garbage they have to put up with to run, right?
Exactly.
Because they're going to have a lot of millions of dollars spent against them, tearing them down.
Right.
So I think few of us would argue that Joe Biden is charismatic in the sense of a Bill Clinton or a Ronald Reagan. What's going on here? So if this were 2016, I think if I'm hearing right from the past few minutes of discussion, if this were 2016, given that people are lying to pollsters, they're just like they're embarrassed to watch wrestling. They say they watch PBS. They're embarrassed to say they're Trump voters, but they do vote for Trump. What's going to happen on Tuesday? Is it the same as 2016? Jim says no.
I'm not even going to touch this after 2016.
No, the polls are better. Learn some lessons. And again, I'm not a social scientist, so I'm a humanities guy. So that's not necessarily my area of expertise. But the numbers and the care and the polling are better for Biden than they were for Clinton.
Let me just kind of echo those sentiments, James. I think that 2016 is not 2020 for a variety of reasons. Indeed, as you were suggesting, Dave, Biden is not the charismatic figure like Obama, Clinton, Reagan, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that, when one looks at his opponent, who is perhaps, I wouldn't call him charismatic, but at least he generates lots of attention. But unfortunately, as his former chief of staff or staffer, Anthony Scaramucci, said, Trump has done something to unify the American people, mostly against him. And so his charisma has been mostly to generate dislike for him. And I think that's so juxtapose Biden versus Trump. I mean, Biden has just by being his normal sort of boring self, if you want to call it that, he, again, by comparison, has a kind of positive charisma. The other thing, I think that, Trump ran against, this, he didn't have a record at the time. He has a record. And I think that it's very difficult to push that aside, despite the fact that on his, the White House website, he was declared as having solved the COVID problem. I mean, so I think there's a record there that people are mindful of, and every day, every second, it's difficult to detach him from that record. And I think that's going to be have one of the major impacts as well.
Okay, I'm going to throw in my prediction. It's the Electoral College will tie at 269, 269.
You just want us to answer that question, Bill.
Okay, I'm going to say what it gets thrown to the House of Representatives that votes by state, and you need 26 states. They won't get it.
Ooh.
The vice president gets thrown to the Senate.
Neither candidate.
And again, under the new Congress. And so we will end up with either acting President Pence or acting President Harris, because the House won't be able to settle it, and we'll settle on one of those two as acting president for the next 4 years. How about that for a script? Where are you, Aaron Sorkin? Give me a call.
Sounds like the House of Cards scenario.
There you go.
Final season House of Cards.
I think, I think in terms of the charisma element, I think some people are really tired of thinking about the president.
Yeah.
They don't, they're sick of, oh no, what was the tweet this time? So they're fine with, and I think, the characteristics or the characterization of Biden as boring, I think those are a bit overplayed. If you ever with the man, he's got a lot of spunk in him. I think there's some fatigue. Another thing, it just is a kind of rhetorical analysis. In 2016, 2015, 2016, Trump's messages, Trump's rhetoric, he's kind of the star of his rhetoric. I just, whether you like that or not, I just simple rhetorical analysis will show he's always the star. But in the 2016 campaign, he spoke about the American people significantly more. He is hyper focused on himself now, and I think that will lose him some voters. So I think you're in trouble if, as a president or as a candidate, you're simply talking about yourself and how you're being treated unfairly. Now, some of that works, particularly if you have this narrative that media is always bad, liberals are always bad, like that is going to play for some people, but I think you can overstep it where you're no longer talking about the people, you're just talking about yourself. And I think as a rhetorical strategy, that's going to come back for the campaign.
David, I'm going to have to leave to go get on another meeting for the election board. But before I do, can I just throw out a couple of things? Number one, today's the last day under state law that you can request an absentee ballot, or rather a vote by mail ballot, as we call it in Illinois. So if you want to vote by mail, you have to make the request today. We'll rush one out to you as soon as possible. If you have a vote by mail ballot, I would say at this point, please put it in one of the drop boxes. Don't put it in the mail. The mail probably get it. In Illinois, we have 14 days after election day to get it, as long as it's postmarked by election day. But if you want to get it in, make sure you put it in a drop box. Number three, if you live in Chicago and you want to vote in person, we announced today we are opening up United Center on election day as our super duper big polling place. Anyone who lives in the city can vote there. And then you can take a selfie in front of the Michael Jordan statue. I think Benny the Bull will be there for the kids, free parking. And finally, please turn up and vote. If you're a citizen in Illinois, you can register. If you are not registered yet, you can register online if you have a driver's license or state ID, or you can register at the polling place on election day or at any of our early voting sites. So I'm all about I want to be the commissioner in the year that we had the biggest turnout ever. So come on out and vote. Okay. And thank you for inviting me on being on this, David. It's been a pleasure. Take care, everyone. Gotta run though.
Thanks, Bill. Everybody else, we're not done, but thanks, Bill.
Okay. Bye-bye now.
I want to pose this out there. We just got a question in the Q&A that said correctly that in 2016, Hillary Clinton said some disparaging things about people that she did not expect to vote for her. And that here today in 2020, the messaging is the same, says the person in the Q&A. And I'm wondering, because that hasn't been my experience watching the messaging from both of the campaigns. So I'm wondering, to what degree does misinformation by a people, that is the American people, now have Google feeds that tend to send us down these partisan rabbit holes, and we tend to have now partisan news reporting between MSNBC and Fox News. Not a lot of us I am, I think you panelists are, but not a lot of us anymore are reading the print newspapers for our news. To what extent is misinformation going to play a role on Tuesday?
I'm glad you are bringing this media issue back up, David, because I was thinking about, has the media been robbed of being a watchdog for government? Because the media in the past was to be the watchdog, was to sort of look at what was going on in an independent, objective way, and to inform the public of the facts. And now there's messaging that facts really aren't facts. It's the first time we've ever seen the leader of the United States deal with Twitter, get the messages through Twitter. And so we've experienced such unconventional, non-traditional experiences happening with media and consumption of media. And do citizens really want to read all of these different media outlets in order to decide, what do I really believe based on what I heard on the news, what I read on Twitter, what I saw on Facebook, what I've seen on Instagram, and what I've read on independent freelance writers who I trust? There's just a lot. And so I'm just wondering, did the entire media allow themselves to lose the power that they once had in terms of really delivering real journalism, because they had to respond to the tweets? I just like to ask you to help me with that, James. And everybody else, but I say James because of the communication background. Because
Well, I think, I mean, this is, yeah, really complex and really important. And I would say this is a really big part of why places like Governor State University are so important, right? I mean, it's not just so you can go out and get jobs to buy things. And again, I'm all for you getting jobs when you get out, but to be a good citizen, to think through things, because we're all getting so many messages, right? And it's hard to know what is true. Can you trust anything? So as far as so media literacy is a really important thing to think through. What is truth is a really important thing. You know, it's not just for one philosophy class that you might be required to take. I mean, it's really something that's going to impact all of life. So I don't know that I have a short answer. I would say that you know, there's different types of bias. So I think you know, if we would say, okay, there's an assignment now, everyone who is a part of this panel has to write a 3-page paper on this panel. We would have as many different papers as we have people who participated in the panel, right? And that's not because people are lying, or, you know, I had the only true one and the rest of you are liars. No, we had different perspectives and picked up different things. So when the news reports something, you know, if they're going to report a week-long protest in a 30-second snippet on the nightly news, yeah, they have to make some choices about what to include and what not to include. So there are some choices. They don't fit the entirety of truth in a broadcast report, or, you know, on a newspaper column. That being said, you know, that is not the same kind of bias as a bias that is purely driven by how do we get the most traffic on our site for you know, to sell advertising revenue. I mean, that is a particular bias. It may not be partisan, but it certainly drives an agenda. Then there are other sites that are clearly driven by ideological or partisan agendas. And so I think even that simple step of, it's not simple, but that step of instead of people writing off the media as all bad, because there's not just one the media, there's a lot of different kinds of media, to think through what are the better ways of reporting, what are the accountability steps, what's the purpose of the publication, because I think those things really do matter.
And again, just to underscore a point that James mentioned about what is the media. I mean, it's interesting. You think about what the media was 40 years ago in terms of covering campaigns and candidates. I mean, you know, I guess we would have been talking about the three major networks, the major newspapers. I think CNN started, was it 1979 or 80? So, you know, it was in its infancy. You know, there was probably still radio stations around, you know, the national radio stations. Then you go 40 years back from that, 1940, just imagine what it was, you know, pre-television, major newspapers, radio, and you go back, you know, you keep on going back. And so the definition as to what the media, what constitutes media is continuing, constantly changes. And so again, when you start to try to position it into, when you pose those questions about which one can I trust, and I think for many people, it just becomes overwhelming. And so there's a tendency probably just to you know, use the least common denominators in selecting a media. I mean, particularly now, if one thinks about all of the choices that are available out there, you know, even if if you can identify your ideological space, there's still a lot of, you know, competing media. And then, you know, there's the factor of time. How much time do people have to devote toward finding that media that I'm most comfortable with? Again, it's an ongoing challenge.
Predictions for Tuesday or after Tuesday? President, Senate, states? Doesn't mean it's your opinion that you want it to happen. The pauses always tell me that people are afraid of violating the ethics.
My prediction is that more people will have voted than we've expected in quite some time. And that, as everyone else has been saying, I think it's a good thing that people are engaged.
Agreed.
Boy, predictions. Actually, can I go back to one other point you asked about misinformation?
Sure.
And sorry, this is just maybe more in my wheelhouse, but okay, so my this is out of state, so I shouldn't violate any ethics laws here. So my wife is running for an office in Wisconsin, and we just on Facebook, there was a couple of nights ago, there was an advertisement from a news source that we've never heard of, that basically promoted a candidate's hit ad against her. And so then you'd look up the news source, and it's this brand new newspaper for our community. And this was something that we saw in 2016, where there are these brand new news sites, and they generally focus on like local communities, and they have like an old-timey newspaper top feel, so that people will trust them.
Masthead.
And then they advertise targeting particular populations on social media, and it's just a way to get out this disinformation. So that's just an actual story of the last few days, just to encourage people to really be careful, because there are plenty of voices out there who want to manipulate you and manipulate your vote, either to co-opt your vote or to just make you so discouraged that you won't vote, because they will be happy to take your power from you. So
most of those also tend to have a lot of outside funding from people who are not in the community but trying to affect the community's politics.
Absolutely. So we saw that in 2016, that tended to be more foreign actors. This year we're seeing that, at least from my experience, and which is somewhat limited, but that those are groups here, wealthy donors here in the States who are trying to do that. But yeah, definitely not from the community. And these are things that they're not complete mysteries. I mean, for all the failings of some of the social media companies, they have put in some safeguards. So if you want to do more than just look at the meme, that look at the meme that tells you something that you may or may not want to hear, and you do some investigating, you can find out that this this news site that is supposed to be in your local community was just started 3 months ago, and they're located on this other side of the country. So you can find those things, but you just have to do the careful work of looking for it. But it's important. Like, what we think is true really matters.
Very much so. Okay, last few minutes. So hard predictions, folks. Give our attendees something that they can really chew on here. Mary, you're muted.
I really don't know what's going to happen on Tuesday. I'm just going to be honest. I feel like I don't want to predict what's going to happen, but what my final words to the public, what my words are, is that every vote matters. And this low efficacy level, that it's going to be the way it's going to be. And my one vote, particularly, I have experienced that in areas of where people might be at the lower spectrum of the social economic status, feeling like the political process and the federal government and the state government, it's going to be what it's going to be. I would just encourage people to know that each vote matters, you matter, and to really exercise that power of the one vote. Because when you put all of the votes together, it matters. And it will make a difference on what happens on Tuesday. So I will be getting out to vote, and I hope that you will be getting out to vote. And don't wait to the last minute, because you want to make sure that your one vote counts.
Mm-hmm. Jim or Don, last words?
I think about, it's moments like this, again, as Mary, and, every vote counts. And, you think about groups trying to get the right to vote. Earlier this morning, I was looking at my email, and I got a message from the public library about a video that just came in for me, and it's about the life of John Lewis. And one thinks about, there's been no American patriot who has done as much for American society as has John Lewis. And what was it essential about what Mary was saying? Recognize no matter what your socioeconomic status, you can have an impact. And I think that's a way of, thinking about, what could happen for those of us who, I've already voted, but I mean, for those of us who are contemplating it, wondering, whether or not my vote will matter, it matters.
Jim? Final words, or you want to leave it to my prediction?
I think so. I think, and this isn't just a cop out of me not wanting to predict. I mean, prediction. I think Joe Biden wins. I'm not sure that we know that on Tuesday night, but I would predict a Biden victory. But my final word, I would just want to say yes and amen to what Mary and Don have said. Look, don't let just your vote, your voice matters, and that's not the end. Like Barack Obama tried to tell us over and over again. Look, voting for a candidate isn't enough. You need to keep working, but include that vote. Mm-hmm. Include that vote. Get out.
Thank you. I think the chances of a Democratic landslide are small. The idea that it's going to be the opposite of Reagan 1984 is for the Democrats is very small. That Joe Biden will win more than 350 electoral votes, and that the Senate will be lopsided in favor of the Democrats. I think that's small, but as we know from small possibilities, I think there is a chance that that could happen. I think there is a larger chance that Trump will win. And here's what I think you should look for on Tuesday night after, and again, I echo all my fellow panelists, after you get out there and vote, make sure you vote. And I've already voted by mail personally, so, and some of you may have too. But Pennsylvania, we're not going to know the result. We might not know the result for a week after Pennsylvania. And the Supreme Court has now twice refused to take the case. Even with Amy Coney Barrett now confirmed, they're not taking the case. So they may take a week to decide. Look to Florida. Florida may be the opposite this year as what it was in 2000. In 2000, Florida kept us going until the middle of December. This year, Florida may decide it on election night because they're going to have all their ballots counted. They're already, I think they may already be counting their absentees or their mail-ins. They may have to have some confidential process to do that because they certainly can't announce those results yet. But they're going to have it all done by election night unless there are problems. If Joe Biden wins Florida on election night, I think Joe Biden is the next president. If Donald Trump wins Florida on election night, I think Joe Biden is probably still the president as long as he wins 3 of the following 4 states. Arizona, where he's looking very good in terms of the polling. Michigan and Wisconsin, which flipped for Trump 4 years ago. And so people are looking very closely at those now, but historically very Democratic. And in 2018, very Democratic. And then Pennsylvania. So Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. If Biden wins 3 out of 4 of those, which he probably will, even if he loses Florida, he will still be the president based on the numbers. And look for Maine and Nebraska to split their votes. But other than that, 2:59 p.m. I want to thank my panelists, those who are still with us and those who have left for their other commitments. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank all of the folks who submitted questions via email, via the Q&A, via the chat box, and all of you who just tuned in to enjoy in this discussion. The recording will be posted shortly, but thank you from the bottom of my heart for everything that you all have done for today's event.
And I want to thank you, David, for pulling this together. You didn't have to do this, but you did. And I'm glad that you did. And what I want to say too is whatever happens on Tuesday, it's going to speak a lot about where America is right now and who America is in these United States.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary.